Yes, then we're up and running. Everyone, welcome. Welcome to KTH Environmental Humanities Lab 10th Stockholm Archipelago Lecture with our acclaimed Kathryn Yusoff. My name is Anja Rieser, and I work at the Environmental Humanities Lab with Marco Armero, that you also see here. And I just wanted to briefly, before Marco gets the word, present the format of today's talk. And as you see, we're in a Zoom webinar where I am calling from the lab in Stockholm, and we have Marco in Italy and Kathryn in London. And Kathryn will have a presentation for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So we encourage you to write your questions in this Q&A button on the bottom. And then after Kathryn's talk, Marco and I will moderate the Q&A with Kathryn. And we also have live captions today, so people who are writing the captions. So if you want to see the captions, you just need to click on this button that says CC, live transcript, at the bottom, and then the captions will appear. So great to see everyone here, and then I will give the word to you, Marco, the director and co-founder of the Environmental Humanities Lab.
Okay, thank you very much. And also, well, I promise I will be very brief, even if I am Italian, so you know that Italian can talk for a long time, but I promise I will be really brief, and this is why I'm looking at my timer here. So thanks, Anja, and a very, very, very warm welcome also from me to our distinguished guest, Professor Yusoff, and all of you here with us today. My name is Marco Armero, and I am the director of the Environmental Humanities Laboratory, which is based at the Division of History of Science, Technology and the Environment at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, in Sweden. Now, before introducing our guest, and I am extremely proud to have Professor Kathryn Yusoff with us today, let me say a few words about the Environmental Humanities Laboratory and this event, the Archipelago Lecture. Now, the Environmental Humanities Lab was founded in 2011, and since then, it has been a space for knowledge experiments and robust public engagement. We have defined our space as an undisciplined space, meaning with it a gesture towards a radical critique of the mainstream production of academic knowledge. Sometimes we have described our lab as an autonomous zone within the rampant neoliberalization of academia. At the Environmental Humanities Lab, we focus on issues such as climate change and climate justice, migration, just transition, environmental movements, urban challenges, environmental justice, and global and local environmental governance. Apart from academic partners from all over the world, we work with cities, social movements, and civic society organizations. Since 2012, the Stockholm Archipelago Lecture opens the yearly activities of the lab. We have been very lucky to have among our guests Amitav Ghosh, Laura Pulido, Nancy Fraser, and Achille Bembe, just to mention a few of them before our distinguished guest for today. For me, the Archipelago Lecture is the perfect way to introduce the EHL, welcome our guests, give them the floor, well represent the EHL attitude. We love to listen, we believe in diversity, and we wish to be challenged to see things we did not notice before. Speaking of listening, now it is time to introduce our guest. Professor Kathryn Yusoff is Professor of Inhuman Geography. What a fantastic title for a discipline, I think it's really something. So she's Professor of Inhuman Geography in the School of Geography at Queen Mary, University of London. Her research examines how inhuman and non-organic materialities have consequences for how we understand issues of Environmental Change, Race, and Subjectivity. She's the author of A Billion Black Anthropocenes, or Known, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2018. Among many articles, I would like to mention Geosocial Formations and the Anthropocene, published with Nigel Clark in Theory, Culture and Society, and The Inhumanities in the Annals of American Geographers. Kathryn's forthcoming book, Geologic Life, Inhuman Intimacies and the Geophysics of Race, addresses the histories of geology and the gravities of race. In her A Billion Black Anthropocenes, or Known, Kathryn has written, I am quoting from her book, historically, both slaves and gold have to be material and epistemically made through the recognition and extraction of their inhuman properties. These historic geologic relations and geologics span Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia through the movement of people, objects, and racial and material categories. End quote. And a bit further in the book we read, and I'm quoting again, coal was the inhuman corollary of those dehumanized black bodies. Coal black, yet histories of the Anthropocenes ubiquitously begin with the meditation on the great white men of industry and innovation to reinforce imperial genealogies, end quote. So, well, after reading these lines, let me reiterate once more how much the lab, the Environmental Humanities Laboratory, is proud to welcome Professor Kathryn Yusoff for this 10th Archipelago Lecture. And the floor is yours, Kathryn.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you, Anya, for facilitating this, and our two caption writers. And I will try to speak slowly and clearly so that, and those of you that don't have English as a first language. Let me just share my screen. There we go. What I'm going to talk about today, in response to the kind of undisciplined space of the lab and its provocation to kind of think critically about the humanities, is really kind of a set of concerns that have traveled with me around the kind of environmental humanities and its neglect and often kind of erasure of questions of race, and to put that in conversation with a question of colonial Earth, to think about the kind of the problem of the Earth seems to be a problem that is very much kind of presented as a sort of a kind of artifactual idea of a certain kind of Earth. And to put it simply, we can think about the Anthropocene, for example, as the name that is given to the Earth that colonialism made and continues to make. So I really wanted to think a bit about this question of colonial Earth in relation to the question of the inhumanities in the environmental humanities. So if we think about the Earth as a kind of iterative artifact or actuality of Earth that is made through ongoing processes of geophysical and geosocial extraction, we can think of this form of extraction as an extraction that labors on behalf of a very partial humanity, and a partial humanity that is marked by racial difference. So colonial Earth is a very kind of partial form and imaginary of the possibilities of Earth. And the Anthropocene tells us scientifically that we are at a certain moment in the formation of or iteration of Earth in a particular set of states, of geophysical states that are at a point of transgression. So the Earth is an ongoing kind of possibility of many Earths. And I want to bring this together with a kind of historical analysis of thinking about the role colonial Earth has played in making the Earth of the Anthropocene, and to reflect on some of the ways in which we might configure a different relation and understanding of Earth towards another kind of Earth. So this assertion for me of the Earth that colonialism has made brings two relations to the fore. And I think one of them is the relation between the humanities and the inhumanities, so the very kind of specific knowledges and forms of critique and engagement by which we come to know the Earth and come to narrate and form analytics around the Earth, and the relation between the inhuman and the inhumane. So the relation between inhuman matter and inhumane acts, and the kind of casting of persons as matter. So historically, colonial Earth proceeded by way of broken Earths, breaking forms of Earth relation and breaking actual worlds. So these colonial Earths are founded on and reside in geotrauma. And this is a screen capture from a film in which Eduardo Glisson, the Caribbean poet and writer, and he's talking about how as a subject of slavery, that he has escaped the abyss, but must carry within him the abyss's dimension. So what does it mean to carry broken Earths into the future, into the afterlives of a kind of set of inhabitations in relation to an ongoing kind of production of colonial Earth? So we can call this a form of geotrauma, a form of geotrauma that is both kind of subjective and earthbound, which is to say it's a specific form of trauma that is concerned with the geos, such as ruptures in geographical time and space caused by colonialism, and its institutionalization of specific colonial forms of time, space, genealogy, gender, sexuality, and ongoing forms of dislocation, diaspora, and environmental devastation. So broken Earths surround and support colonial Earth. And as such, there are many Black Earths that have been co-created in the formation of colonial Earth. The detachment we might understand of colonial Earths are, of course, a fantasy, and they are a fiction that is sustained by particular unequal forms of geologics and geographical relations and imaginations. And these are underpinned by repression of the inhumanity that they bring into the world. So we might also think that it's a time of broken Earths in the naming of the Anthropocene and of abrupt climate change, of the collision of colonial Earth with its shadow Earth. So where the idea of a stable ground is increasingly being destabilized by geo and biological processes and increasing toxification of environmental conditions. And there are moves, while there are these kind of moves to become universal again and jump over the painful legacy of race and its organization of gender and sexuality and other forms of intimacy and attachment, colonial Earth is still centered as the kind of normative mode of reproduction. And we've seen this at COP. And the thing that I want us to notice here is that in the recentering and continued centering of colonial Earth, we are also centering whiteness and the colonial present in its sort of neo, new, and settler forms. So if we think alongside a bounty of physical rewards that colonial Earth gave rise to a very partial set of humanity, We also need to think alongside that the intellectual resources that define the humanities, and the intellectual resources that are our genealogy of of analytics that we bring into the environmental humanities. So while there's a ground rock of the humanities that supports kind of articulations of environments and concern over environments, we also kind of need to pair this with the ending of worlds and the ending of knowledge economies in times of ongoing extinctions, genocides, and anti-Black gravities. So in Sylvia Wynter's words, white utopia was Black inferno. And the dynamics of that inferno created a particular iteration of colonial Earth and its undergrounds. So we can think the broken Earths have a long history through colonial invasions and subjugations, the seismic rifts of Middle Passage, continental dispossession, and indigenous extermination, to the reorganization of island climates and the introduction of alien ecologies, which is to say that colonialism is a geophysical as much as a metaphysical event. And it's precisely this relation between the metaphysical and the geophysical that needs, in my opinion, attention in the environmental humanities, because it's in this space between the metaphysical and the geophysical that the very tendrils of race and extractive principles are secreted and trafficked. It is between the bios and the geos, and in the afterlives of those geophysics of colonial transformation, that race is made. So if geology is a site of differentiation that is historically racialized because of the inhumane root, then what implications does this hold for our epistemologies of the inhuman, for how we think and engage with the inhuman appearance of the Anthropocene? And if we think about the Anthropocene as being kind of, as coming into an appearance that speaks to future extinctions, but fails to notice its own, and those that have defined its coming into being, there is a question of how futurity is mapped into the differentiation of geologic life, either through attention to these broken grounds or through the maintenance of colonial Earth and its forms of social reproduction. So today I want to address the Inhumanities as a kind of social theory for a missing Earth. And I want to address briefly 4 dimensions of inhumanism to set out a number of concerns about the environmental humanities and its resident whiteness. And so I'm going to make these comments in light of a long history of complicity of the humanities in scripting the effectual geographies of imperialism and settler colonialism, and upholding their racial geologics as much by omission as by active campaign. So the discipline I'm in, for example, in geography, is at the center of this geoengineering of the environment and its geoscripting of spatial imaginaries that both undertake and refuse the work of race. So what I want to offer today is the proposition of the Inhumanities as an analytic that centers and addresses the material confluences of race and environment in the epistemic construction of the humanities and social sciences, and specifically in the context of the Anthropocene and its very explicit kind of formation of a political geology. I also want to draw out alongside this a conversation about the Earths that colonialism makes. In arguing to center race, we can think of this as a way to reconceptualize and challenge the disciplinary approaches of the environmental humanities, while also understanding why it's such a hostile environment for Indigenous and Black studies scholars. Foregrounding the joined historic geographies of racialization and Earth ecological transformation through the discipline of colonial, or what I call white geology, within the context of current settler colonialism and neo-extractivism, sets the very conditions for thinking materially about decolonization as a geologic process. And we can think here about the reformation of geologic subjectivities that might be entailed in relation to things like thirst, hunger, exposure, as well as pressure, anti-Black violence, and forms of geographic abandonment. So the explicit formation that I'm urging us to consider here is of race as a geophysical proposition. So if we understand the social life of geology as a method to understand how Black and brown subjects are subtended in the unearthing of geopowers, and these are geopowers that accrue from geologic extraction and the history of its grammars. And here I'm thinking about the process of valuation, land, territory, and the verticality of relations, epistemes of matter and discourses of materiality, and the very figuration of the anthropos itself. So all this is to understand that racial violence is the violence of matter, and to see white supremacy as a geologic operation. So to address that violence is to critically understand the histories of matter and their geologics. And for me, this is concerned with the inhuman and its oscillating relation with the inhumane as a critical site in its dismantling, but also a refocusing of concern away from the figure of the human and that kind of, and its partial humanism. So I'm going to briefly lay out 4 inhumanities and then kind of move on to a brief discussion of how the inhuman frames the ground of subjecthood and the transformation of the earth, and why we might need to think these things together. So we can think of inhumanism as the racial geophysics of anti-Black and brown gravities. So that is to think kind of humanism through the verticality of its geopolitics, of its inhuman geopolitics, what might be understood as a kind of racial geophysics. So racialized access and historic material dynamic that pushes down to lift up. So you might think about this as the kind of racial flip of geology. So it's not just about a hierarchy of race, but a totality of state that informs pressure, gravity, and being, that pushes certain subjects closer to the violence of the earth. And to situate this, I want to just use 2 guide quotes. And the first one is from the 1950s film, The Salt of the Earth, about mining and geologies of settler colonialism in New Mexico. And the central character of the film, Esperanza, lays out the stratigraphy of relations, and she's confronting her husband, Ramon, and she says, "Why are you afraid not to have me at your side? Do you still think you can have dignity only if I have none? The Anglo bosses look down on you, and you hate them for it. Stay in your place, you dirty Mexican. That's what they tell you. But why must you say to me, stay in your place? Do you feel better having someone lower than you? Whose neck shall I stand on to make me feel superior? And what will I get out of it? I don't want anything lower than I am. I'm low enough already. I want to rise and push everything up with we as I go. And if you can't understand this, you're a fool." And the second quote I want to frame this with is from Sylvia Wynter, the Jamaican scholar. And she said, "What was this something, I asked myself, that needed as its own condition of existence the systematic impoverishment of the darker peoples of the world, the no less systematic inferiorization of the Black and other non-white peoples of the earth?" So both these quotes can be read through the dual dynamics of extraction and racialization as a form of geophysics, of elevation of white surfaces and the subjugation of the wretched into the earth. And thus this geophysics is racialized and gendered. In this fractured stratigraphy of relation in extraction, race is the governing structure that organizes forms of life or bios, forms of life that are recognized as life, and the organization of matter or geos, and forms of life that are recognized as non-life. So Eduardo Glissant, speaking in Nathaniel Dewari's film, names this precisely when he says about the state of this being. And he says, what relates is not a story, but a world state, a state of the world, end quote. Which is to say that the forms of extraction that make colonial Earth name a state of the Earth in their territorial implications understood as property, but also a state of the Earth as a set of geophysical properties. So then we might begin and move on to think about what sustains whiteness through as a kind of geophysical property. So the second question that I want to raise is really to think about extraction as a question of the geophysics of race, as extraction being intimately tied to the elevation of certain forms of life, such as whiteness, above the organization of those that get pushed into a matter economy. And here we might notice, pay attention to Sylvia Wynter's work on sort of new world systems and how that gives rise to georaciality. So how kind of in the organization of the new world, that certain geo-governing codes integrated peoples into sets and dynamics of geologics and forms of relationality to the Earth. And this is Kathryn McKittrick here, and she says, these governing codes produce racialized non-Europeans, non-white, New World, indigenous African peoples as first fallen untrue Christians in the 15th and 16th century, and later as biologically defected and damned in the 19th century. And we can begin to understand, if we follow Sylvia Wynter's mapping of these categories, how the Anthropocene gives rise to a kind of a form of a cut, another cut in the system of georaciality that is organized around geology. So we might begin to think about inhumanism as a proximity between the inhuman and the inhumane. And we can think here about the deadly fungibility between the so-called designation of non-living matter, of the inhuman, and the conditions and categories of experience that proceed as if persons were inhuman property and devoid of subjecthood, and most notably in the trade in human beings under slavery. So the Inhumanities refers to the classificatory systems and the natural philosophies of thought that are desubjectifying. So they target particular populations into things, properties, or properties of energy. And they're structurally subjugating to Black and brown life in the afterlives of invasion, slavery, and imperialism. So this dual effect of subjugation is to underground agency in a body of matter rather than rights, and under slavery and settler colonialism. So Blackness was seen as a source of energy that was cultivated as a signifier and a carceral category to produce value through extraction, in which race was implicit in the material reproduction of whiteness and settler futurity, as indigeneity is folded into the unit of land. So in both these matter flattenings, racial formations are made by way of the extractive impulse, which builds racial capitalism into a globally functioning system that is world altering. So that's how and through the mechanisms and dynamics that colonial Earths emerge. So race was the codification of unequal distributions of geopowers and its accumulation and placement of certain lives in material and psychic proximity to the inhuman, and therefore less conspicuous in the judicial and ethical recognition of political subjectivity. So that kind of geophysics also has a kind of effect on systems of apprehension and recognition. So these proximities are what Eduardo Glisson calls painful histories, alongside the ongoing structure of the attempted erasure of indigenous people and the brutal abandonments and orphanage of the Middle Passage and all the other diasporic journeys that live in the silence in between. So this is not just a shadow in a colonial world and its afterlife. Glisson claims this intimacy with the inhuman as his own, and as a growth that should not be disavowed, but which grew out of a resistance to the enslaving will. And talking to Nathaniel Dewari on the Queen Mary II, he said, Columbus had left for what he called the New World, and I am the one that returned from it, as something else, a free entity, not only free, but a being who has gained something. In relation to the unity of the enslaving will, we have the multiplicity of the anti-slavery will. So the very ground and possibility of a future, Glisson's work suggests, requires owning this earth and its watery inheritance, but owning without originating a single origin story. In this resistance, he speaks to the configuration of colonialism in the genealogical account of racial difference and its erasures of the origins of others. So resisting a narrative of overcoming or redemption, Glisson's call is one of openness to these proximities and an assertion of the political need to build up a poetics of reconstitution. So to kind of occupy that space with new languages of being that materially build through those erasures, putting words on long abandoned bones and taking up stories from the silt of the earth where they lay. This alluvial subjectivity of the dark oceanic abyss is what Fanon calls the abysmal, and it replaces the divisions and segregations of the world and specifies them in their geographies. So contrary to the imperial archive, implicit in Glisson's work, and that of Fanon and Césaire, is an inhuman solidarity as a basis of a history and a presence of relation. What might be regarded as the letting go of the mastery of nature and matter in Julieta Singh's terms, and its normative modes of apprehension as nature and natural resource. So recognition of the porosity of being with the inhuman highlights the imbricated worlds of extraction across earth and subjects, but it also offers a possibility towards a future of the return of the anti-slavery will. So here we might turn to think of inhumanism as a mode of subjectivity that decenters the Enlightenment or humanist subject in environmental humanities and cultures of the Anthropocene. Echoing Sylvia Winter, Alexis Wahaley asks, what different modalities of the human come to light if we do not take the liberal humanist figure of man as the master subject, but focus on how humanity has been imagined and lived by those subjects excluded from this domain? And concentrating on that, what different modalities of the subject come to light, we might also ask a parallel question about what environments, geophysics, and ecologies can also be imagined and lived if we abandon the humanist figure of man and start from the location of the inhumanism that built the humanities. And that is also to acknowledge the very central figure of the inhuman and as a subject position within the history of the humanities. So these are practices that range from institutions, societies, and empirical data practices that built the humanities, funded from the spoils of invasion, enslavement, and extraction, to the very natural history practices of racial dehumanization and subject codification. but they also return in the present in much more discrete forms. So if we think about an inhuman epistemology, it would go looking for impossible possibilities that were crafted by those making freedom in the tight registers of colonialism and its afterlives, which is to say that the inhumanities already exists and lives in that resistance and survivals that have been made in the violent register of the humanities and in its deadening spaces of the inhumane. So the inhumanities can be tooled as a biopolitical inoculation against the presumptive logics of the environmental humanities to take their grounding subject as read, which means staying with an Enlightenment Kantian subject that is built on and through the pain of others, and as such is a subject that does not consciously carry its inheritance as a site of remediation and redress. And this is an important point, is the kind of the modes of remediation, redress, and reparation that these specific kind of organizations of subjectivity and nature need to make. So as a child of a colonial discipline, geography, and an interloper in the environmental humanities, I'm deeply aware of how easily this inheritance is slipped in the rush towards various forms of redemptive narratives and action-oriented savings in much depleted environmental worlds. So there's the kind of, what I'm urging here is a kind of resistance to the easy gratification of what is to be done and a focus on the kind of what has been done as a way to negate the kind of the rush towards a futurism that carries with it kind of the scenes and architectures of colonial Earth. So in Jyoti Singh's work, Unthinking Mastery, she puts forward an argument for dehumanism as a critical mode for decentering the white patriarchal subject and dislodging the tyranny of the white settler family and of mastery itself. What might be understood as the mythos of white man's burden, or in the age of the Anthropocene, white man's overburden. So Singh says she's interested in, to quote, to explore as well how such dwellings might enable us to become exiled from subjectivities founded on and through mastery. This is a practice I call dehumanism, a practice of recuperation, of stripping away the violent foundations, always structural and ideological, of colonial and neo-colonial mastery that continue to render some beings more human than others. Dehumanism requires not an easy repudiation and renunciation of dehumanization, but a form of radical dwelling in and with dehumanization through the narrative excesses and insufficiencies of the good human, a cohabitation that acts on and through us in order to imagine other forms of political allegiance. So Singh here seeks to summon a kind of hopeful spirit of queer inhumanisms. Dehumanism begins with the dehumanized human and their others as a critical point of departure, she says. So in this shifting of inhumanisms to dehumanisms, Singh seeks to overcome a prefix that does not, she says, intuitively signal the history of the making of non-human subjects and forms of being. So Singh's project here is of unlearning and unmaking of narrative forms of mastery, is compelling in the sense that it gathers together the dehuman and the decolonial in a way that connects across the reach of colonial mastery across bodies and forms of organization of the world. So Singh shifts, I think this shift that Jyoti Singh is talking about of inhumanism to dehumanism is a kind of useful reminder in terms of addressing the legacies of colonialism, as it shifts attention from the racial schema of whiteness as a category of mere accumulation to sharpen a focus on the attachment to supremacy that propels whiteness as a distinct formation and grammar of action over. So action over forms of dispossession. My own persistence with the term inhumanism is, as with my chosen title of Professor of Inhuman Geography, is precisely to work against the intuitive, to grasp its non-normative workings and let in, as it were, a cosmic potential alongside inhuman geographies that are the discipline's legacy. So here I want to make a distinction between a kind of a dehumanizing subject position and the work of geology as an activation within inhuman geographies. So here we might think of a colonial history of inhumanism that precisely generated and languaged a crossing of the abysmal divide between the inhuman and the human, and in which space a new language was born to speak otherwise of this condition. So this is an already occupied space. So rather than attempting to sort of reinvest the human or to kind of relocate the analysis on dehumanization, the suggestion here is to remain within this kind of schism or abysmal space of inhumanism as a kind of geophysical space, a rift, a possibility for creating new languages of both earth and subject. So this is what Fanon referred to in the introduction of Black Skins, White Masks as the cosmic yes. In his exacting and elegetic engagement with Fanon, David Marriott shows how Fanon's understanding of the zone of non-being is not a, quote, descent into the zone as nihilism or despair. Rather, he counters with a vision of subjectivity as a yes that vibrates to cosmic harmonies. So if whiteness is a geopower, Blackness might be seen as a cosmic power. And this is kind of Fanon's reach to the cosmic as a kind of zone of possibility within this kind of carceral zone of non-being. So it produces a yes, it produces a revolutionary power, and it's revolutionary precisely because the anti-Black world cannot contain or sustain that affirmation of Black life, as being and as having a claim on the world. So the claim in this yes is the positivity of what becomes political violence in Fanon's later work. That's to quote Marriott. So the cosmic yes answers an epistemic invention in the register of its inhuman emplacement. So rather than that inhuman placement being an impediment, it's the very possibility of a kind of invention of an epistemic eruption and revolution in thought and language and action. And here Fanon says, I am Black, I am total fusion with the world, in sympathetic affinity with the earth, losing my id in the heart of the cosmos. And the white man, however intelligent he may be, is incapable of understanding Louis Armstrong or songs from the Congo. I am Black not because of a curse, but because my skin has been able to capture all the cosmic efflua. I am truly a drop of sun under the earth. So here kind of Fanon, if you think about the geophysics he's creating here, he's putting the sun under the earth. So he's taking kind of the horror of racial undergrounds and reinvesting and repopulating that space with the earth and with the kind of possibility of a kind of cosmic affinity that gives rise to a new geophysical sense, but also new revolutionary possibility. So in the fourth realm of embodied geology, we can think of the Inhumanities as a form of cosmic affinity, in which we recognize the Inhumanities as a praxis and also a kind of aid memoir, a kind of counterintuitive engagement that forces us to put Black and Indigenous and brown geographies at the center of our analysis, and to grapple with the violent segregations of nature and subjective life, and the divisions that have risen a cavern between what is designated as life, the kind of preferential forms of subjectivity and orientation that organize from that site of division. So if we think of race as made between the bios and geos, the reoccupation of that space is a potential kind of spatiality of liberation, of freedom, of possibility to actually reorient the sort of non-normative forms of engagement with Earth. So the Inhumanities is, in its cosmic dimension, is about expanding the universe, and it's deeply interested in the stretch of the geophysical world in making spaces of freedom. And here, if we return to Sylvia Wynter and her mapping of man 1 and man 2, so man 1 is the kind of invented in response to European encounter, so with New World geographies, is the kind of rational political subject, and man 2 is the subject informed by kind of Darwinian evolution and sociogenetic principles. Then here we might also add to this an extension of our present day of man 3, informed by the grammars of geology. So man 3 would be taken apart and reorganized through a kind of cosmic affinity, and was in light of post-colonial activities. So while pressure has been put on the figure of the human, its historicized, racialized, and gendered forms, it's not just this kind of hermeneutics of the human that is needed. So not just this kind of movement from colonial man to Anthropocene man, from man 1 to man 3, from master subject or matter subject, anthropos, for example, but alongside an unearthing of the ground that materially constitutes the figure of the human through the examination of what we might kind of think of as geologies of race. So geologies of race is a way to understand the conjoined material practice of colonial terror and subject forming in its geosocial relation and its kind of legacies in the present as a kind of colonialism now. So we might think of this as a form of kind of a performance that in Fanon's work speaks beyond petrification, so beyond these kind of forms of stratified subject position. And Marriott says of Fanon's work, negritude thus becomes the bearer of a new performativity. It speaks for those who lie beyond petrification. Thus, the poem has been seen as the outcome of a refusal that is also a resuscitation, giving the socially dead new life. The enslaved dead have literally arrived, quite literally, from a time without us, from a past not our own, from a time that is not historical. As such, they denote the supernatural limit of what it means to be a person. So Marriott there is rereading the question of negritude in Frantz Fanon back through the kind of deadening and flattening categories of the inhuman as a form of resuscitation, as a form of delimitation of what he calls the supernatural limit of what it means to be a person. So we can see here this kind of huge force, and it's a geoforce because it's tied to the limits of the universe and the kind of supernatural overcoming, in a sense, of the very possibilities of being an earth beyond petrification. And similarly, in The Wretch of the Earth, Fanon talks about this kind of state of being as of non-being as about a kind of, it's not just about recapture or negation, but it's about forms of transcendence. And this is a different set of kind of the idea of a kind of transcendence that brings the sun back down to the earth is a different form of futurity than that which is offered in the work of Black feminist futurity, for example. That's much more kind of located in the kind of rifts and struggles and refuses, in a sense, that kind of transcendence. But I think what's important to notice here is the ways in which the redefinition of the possibilities of being are always, and because of these painful histories, in negation and articulation with the inhuman. So we can think about forms of solidarity as a sedimentation and radical confrontation with forms of stratal geopower. So this kind of stratal geopower of whiteness. So C.L.R. James, for example, is making connections between workers in Jamaica and the working class in England, and trying to re-articulate the forms of kind of affiliation between different stratas of power. And here, Frederick Douglass is calling on the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake as a kind of set of resources in which to rethink and retell the possibility of inhabitation. So I want to end just by suggesting that the Inhumanities is a means to compose, to reconceptualize, and challenge existing disciplinary approaches of the environmental humanities that acknowledges rather than erases the collaborative junctures between metaphysical designations of the human and the geophysical praxis that brings subjective forms materially into being. So this geologic praxis refers both to the extraction of natural and psychic resources for the maintenance of white heteropatriarchy, but it also regulates racist structures of extraction and subjugation. So I see race as a geophysical tool that can be dismantled through insurgent geophysics. And here, Amy Césaire is suggesting that poetic knowledge is born in the great silence of scientific knowledge, that it's only through new languages of a kind of radical poetry that brings into conversation the inhuman as a site in the traffic of subjective and material forms of life, that the possibility for decolonizing the entanglement of race and geographical processes becomes possible. So as the category of the inhuman is positioned as ahistorical, often in deep or geologic time, and therefore placed outside of racial capitalism in order to kind of propel its notions of time and space, it also holds the potential for reimagining the dimensions of time and space and reimagining another Earth. And it's a site for materially undoing racial capitalism. So the Inhumanities as an analytic puts a kinship between the extraction of bodies and the extraction of earth at the core of its concerns about the possibilities and potentialities of lives conjoining genocide and ecocide as tenants in the colonial project and in their kin, settler colonialism and resource capitalism. This move from a biocentric paradigm to a geocentric one includes rethinking how the social and political configurations of subjectivity have been thought and experienced in relation to the earth, whereby extraction drives a particular formation and what and who gets to constitute a natural resource, and where these activities of extraction take place in relation to the accumulation of value. But the inhuman, however, can never be totally incorporated into a political subject or being as such because of the material differentiation between figure, the political subject of a juridical right, so the figure of bios, and the ground, so the material resource enabling the becoming of the political subject. And it's this very division between the bios and the geos that needs to be taken apart. And this is where I think the work of poetry and of a kind of radical geopoetics that addresses and was made in the wake of this space sets out another path and kind of dissolve of that and blur of that boundary between the bios and the geos. So if we think with this double life of the inhuman as matter and as race, a salvage form of subjectivity that is organized as a category becomes a way in which to imagine a sense of possibility and to think towards not a better humanism, but a counter-imaginary that opens up a fullness in the register of the earth as relation rather than the world, colonial world, as extractable earth. And I'm going to leave it there with a quote from Edouard Glissant in relation to recent events in the English Channel. And he suggests, we know ourselves as part and as crowd in an unknown that does not terrify. We cry our cry of poetry. Our boats are open and we sail them for everyone. Thank you.